Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night and felt like someone was watching you? Or heard footsteps in your house but knew you were alone? Strange things happen all around us, but not everyone is brave enough to look them in the eye. Today I will tell you some true horror stories about supernatural encounters. Make sure you are not alone when you hear these stories. Story 1. The Haunting of 2921 First Street. In 2011, I moved into a seemingly historic rental house in El Paso, Texas, with my 2 sons. The house was spacious and affordable, with a large backyard for our dogs and plenty of room for us to be comfortable. The landlord, who lived right across the street, assured us that he would be there if any problems arose. However, it wasn't long before unsettling things began to happen. My first night in the house, I was relaxing in my bedroom when I heard faint singing coming from the air conditioning vent. At first, I dismissed it, assuming it was my son's girlfriend, who had a beautiful voice. But when I mentioned it to my son the next morning, he insisted that the singing seemed to be coming from my room. This discrepancy set the tone for the strange events that followed. The house, built in 1959, had a unique L-shaped layout. The bedroom and bathroom were on one side, while the den, dining room, and kitchen were on the other. The garage was separated by a wrought iron door that would mysteriously unlock itself, both when we left and when we came in. Even stranger were the old-fashioned push-button light switches. The guest bathroom light would randomly turn on in the middle of the night, but only when we were awake. No one was around when this happened. One particularly creepy incident involved my brother, who had come over to help set up the new Wi-Fi modem. After hooking everything up, he went into the bathroom. When he flipped the light switch, a distinctive loud click echoed throughout the house. He immediately screamed in shock. We later discovered that this loud click was a regular occurrence in the house. I purchased a censored light to help my disabled son at night. It has 4 settings: off, dim, medium, and bright. Oddly enough, the light would turn on by itself between midnight and 2 a.m., always on medium. My son, whose limited range of motion prevents him from reaching the light, could not be held responsible. In an effort to document these events, I downloaded a ghost hunting app and measured the EMF around the house. Despite turning off all the lights, the EMF was still high in my son's room and the guest bedroom. One night, as my girlfriend and I were about to fall asleep, she screamed, saying she saw a dark figure at the door. I rushed outside and saw the figure moving toward the bathroom, but it disappeared before my eyes. When I spoke to the landlord about these events, he revealed that he had purchased the house from the estate of a woman who had died there. She lived alone, estranged from her family, as her mental condition worsened. The haunting experiences increased, and we eventually moved. It was on the last night. As we were finishing up our move, I took the advice of a local ghost hunter and spoke to the entity. I told it to stay in the house and not follow us. As we drove away, we saw one of the vertical blinds in the kitchen window move as if someone was watching us leave. Years later, I learned more about the woman who had lived there. She was found dead in the hallway between my son's room and the bathroom, where the lights turned on and off by themselves. She had also become increasingly violent and paranoid, creating a kind of shrine in the room where my son slept. Her anger and isolation seemed to have left a lingering presence in the house. Even now, I wonder about the new tenants and whether they are experiencing the same disturbing phenomena that haunted us. Story 2. Hauntings at a building site. In a quiet corner of England, where the fog rolls in thick from the moors and the evenings turn dark and cold early in the season, my father, a seasoned builder, was commissioned to renovate an old council house. against the building. A three-story apartment complex had been left vacant for years, its rooms untouched and empty, a void standing in the midst of an otherwise lively neighborhood. The council had kept it empty to prevent theft and vandalism, but the emptiness had left the place with an air of desolation that was impossible to ignore. The building itself was an imposing structure with a central staircase that wound its way from the ground floor to the top, visible through a central shaft that gave the place an eerie sense of openness. My father had been in the business for decades, and buildings like this were nothing new to him. Yet there was something about this place that made him uneasy from the moment he set foot inside. One evening, before the renovation work was set to begin, my father decided to make a solo visit to the site. He wanted to assess the scope of the work, to get a feel for the building, and to make sure there were no surprises waiting for him. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement as he unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of damp plaster and old wood, and the sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty hall. As he walked through the rooms, one by one, the unease he had felt earlier began to grow. Each room was a mirror of the last, empty, silent, and filled with the oppressive weight of abandonment. The further he ventured, the stronger the feeling became that he was not alone. It was as if the very walls were watching him, their silent gaze following his every move. At first, he dismissed the sensation as nerves, an oddity of being alone in such a large, empty space. But as he climbed the central staircase, heading to the second floor, the feeling intensified. It wasn't just a vague sense of being watched anymore. It was a palpable presence, something unseen but undeniably there, lurking just out of sight. He stopped halfway up the stairs, his breath catching in his throat as he turned to look behind him. The hallway below stretched out in eerie silence, empty as far as the eye could see. There was no one there, yet the sensation of being watched was stronger than it was, as if someone or something was standing right behind him, waiting for him to move. Trying to shake off the fear, he continued up the stairs, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Each room he entered seemed colder than the last, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. By the time he reached the top floor, the sensation had become unbearable. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, pressing against him, suffocating him with their silent, watchful presence. Unable to take it any longer, my father hurried back down the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He locked the door behind him and left the building, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the keys. He didn't tell anyone about the experience that night. Instead, he went home, trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, that the empty building had gotten under his skin. But the next day, when he returned to the site with his colleague, Martin, the feeling returned. It was as if the building had been waiting for him, its silent, watchful presence ready to resume where it had left off. My father wasn't the superstitious type. He had always prided himself on being a rational, logical man. But there was something about this place that defied explanation. As they worked, Martin, too, began to sense something was off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was an uneasiness that settled over him as they moved through the rooms. When my father finally shared his experience from the previous night, Martin's face went pale. He had heard stories from the residents of the nearby buildings, tales of strange noises and ghostly figures seen in the windows late at night. They had always dismissed them as local folklore, but now, standing in the middle of the silent, empty building, they weren't so sure. My father, a staunch skeptic of the supernatural, was deeply disturbed by the encounter. Though he had never believed in ghosts or spirits, this experience was unlike anything he had ever encountered in his long career. The eerie atmosphere of the building, combined with the unsettling stories from the residents, left a deep impression on him. Even years later, he would recount the tale with a mixture of disbelief and unease, the memory of that silent, watchful presence lingering in his mind. It was a reminder that some things in this world defy explanation, that there are places where the boundaries between the living and the dead blur, and where the past refuses to stay buried. Story 3. The Haunted Museum Basement. My husband and I had been looking forward to our visit to Zach Bagans' Haunted Museum in Las Vegas, known for its collection of strange artifacts and creepy exhibits. The museum promised a spooky experience, especially with an upgraded tour that included access to the basement, an area rumored to harbor the most malevolent energies. We arrived on a sultry evening, the desert heat lingering even after the sun dipped below the horizon. As we joined the tour group, my excitement was tempered by a creeping sense of dread. The museum's dim hallways and antique furnishings set an ominous tone, but it wasn't until we descended the basement stairs that my anxiety turned to outright fear. The basement was a maze of dark, narrow passageways and oppressive silence. The air grew colder as we walked deeper, the only sound being our footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. My husband, ever the skeptic, assured me that it was just our anxiety playing tricks on us, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if invisible eyes were watching our every move. We came to a small, creepy hallway that led to a room marked by a pentagram on the floor. The air in the hallway felt thicker, heavier, and each step became more difficult. As we stood in the doorway, I glanced at my husband, ready to voice my displeasure, but my words froze in my throat. Behind him, a figure emerged from the shadows, a dark, indistinct shape shrouded in black. It wasn't just a silhouette. It seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, its shape shifting unnaturally. I could see his eyes, two glowing crimson orbs, staring straight at me. My instinct screamed for me to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. I reached out to my husband, but he was absorbed in examining the pentagram, oblivious to the looming presence behind him. My heart pounded as I tried to summon the strength to call out to him, but my voice was only a whisper, barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, and a chill enveloped us. The figure seemed to move closer, its eyes burning with a sinister hunger. I could feel its presence growing more oppressive, as if it were absorbing my fear. Panicking, I turned and dashed up the stairs, my footsteps a frantic symphony of terror on the concrete. I rushed into the main floor, panting, my pulse pounding in my ears. My husband followed, concern etched on his face, but I could see the disbelief in his eyes as I told him about the figure. As we left the museum, I glanced back at the basement entrance. The shadowy figure still lingered in my mind, its presence a dark blotch on the evening. We never spoke of it again, but the memory of that night remained etched in my mind, a haunting reminder of the malevolent force that lurked in the shadows of the basement. Months later, I returned to the museum, hoping to find a rational explanation for my experience. However, the basement offered no clues or confirmation. It was as if the sinister presence had disappeared, leaving only an unsettling. The fear I once felt was gone, but the shadowy figure in the dark corners of my memory remained, a cold ghost of that fateful night.